Shame. It's ugly. We often try to hide our embarrassing exposure. I mean, nobody wants to talk about shameful events. I mean, guilt tells us a mistake has been made. But shame, it goes one step further and says, you are a failure. It's your fault. You did it. You're wrong. This identity is paralyzing. And in 2 Samuel chapter 9, grace conquers shame. Isn't that wonderful? And mercy rejoices because of undeserved favor. Last session we talked about David and Mephibosheth. Well, today I want to talk about Mephibosheth and David. We're going to look at it from a different perspective. Their relationship started all because a covenant was made between David and Jonathan. In 1 Samuel chapter 20, David and Jonathan make that covenant that even after Jonathan dies, that David will continue to show how much he loves and how much he will care for the house of Jonathan. So before Mephibosheth was born, he was being cared for. Before you were born, God was caring for you. David would care for his family, and Mephibosheth is a reminder that when you least expect a blessing, God's going to show up. God will send someone to meet you, someone to bless you. He will do it through a person, through an event, through a divine encounter, through a divine touch. When we least expect it, God shows up. He shows up in the midst of our shame. Well, Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. But the problem is, and what we don't think about is, he was not always Mephibosheth. 1 Chronicles chapter 8, verse 34, and also chapter 9, verse 40 says the exact same words. The son of Jonathan was Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth begot Micah. So this lets us know Jonathan, Mephibosheth, Micah. Now, Mephibosheth, that means opponent of Baal. It's an exterminator of shame, a dispeller of shame, of idols, an idol breaker. That's a strong name. It means no shame's going to show up around here. I'm proud. I'm victorious. I live a life of grace. I don't carry guilt. And that's the way this baby was born and how the little prince lived. Until one day, things changed. His name changed. See, Mephibosheth meant son of shame. And all this happened because the events of one day. 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 4 clearly explains what happens. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and that was the news of their death. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. A difficult childhood. From beginning to end, life was one of trials and discomfort. He was a grandson of Saul, and the son of Jonathan, and nephew of the former king Ishbosheth. But, imagine being a 5-year-old running around the palace. Your dad, he is the crown prince. He's going to be the next king, and well, that puts you in a very good place. Until one day, they've been all fighting, and word comes back that your father and your grandfather, they've both been killed. And the Philistines might even be coming. The nurse who was in charge of him was terrified. And she took off running. And can you imagine running as fast as you can and pulling and perhaps even dragging a 5-year-old along? It says Mephibosheth fell. We don't know the details of the fall. If he fell down a gully, if she tripped on top of him, what happened? All we know is that he fell. And as a result of that fall, he became lame for life. Now, perhaps, as I've thought about this, maybe the fall wasn't all that terribly bad to start with. But the fact that he fell and they were running, he had to get up and continue running on those injured feet. How often are we like Mephibosheth? We get hurt and we just keep on going in spite of our hurt, and our hurts get worse and worse and worse. That's what happened. And so she carried him from his home to the place called Lodabar. And he was probably taken there to be hidden from retaliation against the enemies, maybe even hidden from David and his clan, who they thought would be enemies of his. Or perhaps it was because during that day, anyone who had a disability of any type would be hidden away, especially if they were family members of someone important. So life for him was a series of disasters, disappointments, anxieties. Death in the family, loss of home, living with strangers. And many of us have been like Mephibosheth. We have been injured by someone else's stumbling. The nurse says she stumbled and he fell. And many times, maybe we're even the nurse. We stumble and hurt someone and we don't even realize we've hurt them. And she may not have realized that day just the extent of Mephibosheth's injuries. And then sometimes with the injuries, they're not always physical. They might be spiritual injuries or even emotional injuries. Injuries that go on and on for a long time. We may injure others without knowing what we have done, or we may keep on going without realizing at the moment that we've even been injured. Well, Mephibosheth lives like this until one day David remembers his covenant. He remembers the promise that he made to Mephibosheth's father, and he calls his people in the palace and he said, I wonder, is there anyone left of the household of Saul that I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? And a search was made, and they said, well, we found someone by the name of Ziba. He calls him in, and he says, are you Ziba? And he says, at your service. And and David says, is there still anyone left of the household of Saul that I can show kindness to? And here he's just saying that I want to show the kindness of God. I want God to, and he has no idea what to expect. And Ziba said, oh yeah, there is this one son. There's a son of Jonathan, but he is lame in his feet. Lame in his feet. That's how he was defined. It wasn't said, oh, here's the son of Jonathan, the one who should have been prince. This is the son of Jonathan, and he's the grandson of King Saul. This is the son of Jonathan, and he's lame. Wow, you ever feel like that when someone describes a weakness that you have? A trait that you're not real proud of? More shame was put on top of Mephibosheth because of the definition of the way people talked about him. David said, I don't care. He says, where is he? I want him. I want to know where he is. And Ziba said, well, of course, indeed. He's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. King David sent and brought him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. Now, Lodabar. It means pastureless. It means a land of no bread. He was living in a place where he could not grow. And the Bible so often, when the Bible speaks about bread, like the house of Judah being the place of bread, Bethlehem being the house of bread, it's talking about spiritual food as well as physical food. And it said that there was pastureless. It meant there was no physical food, and no bread, meaning no spiritual food. So we have Mephibosheth now, who's been placed here and grown up here with his lameness in a place where he cannot grow or improve physically or spiritually. And he lived in the house of Machir, whose name means sold to tumble into ruins, to perish, to be brought low, to decay. So he's been taken to a place where he cannot grow for the purpose of decaying and rotting and dying there. Yes, Mephibosheth knew the meaning. He knew what it was like to be there, and he knew what the people around him were like. Remember this because we're going to see this later on again with David. But he said here, Mephibosheth, he's in a place where he can't grow, and he's been left there to perish. And so he calls him. Now, imagine Mephibosheth. You're in a place of shame and despair where you expect to die. And then you're being called by the king of Israel. Imagine what he felt. I can probably sum it up in one word: fear. He was afraid. He had gone through so much due to his childhood injuries, losing his father, his grandfather, and his home all in one day, being taken into a land where he was expected not to grow and expected to die. Tell you what, he had no hope that this meeting was going to turn out well. And so he comes to David, probably with his crutches, and he falls before him and he prostrates himself in surrender and humility. This humble bearing is consistent with his chronically broken spirit. He had lived 15 years, approximately, without knowing about the covenant that David and Jonathan made. He was 5 when he found out the day they died. 5 probably, when that covenant was made that last time, when it was renewed there in the woods that very last time. He was a relative of Saul, and he feared death. He had never knew that the king had entered into the covenant with his father. And he never thought that because of the covenant, that the king would extend grace to one as shameful as he. Oh, but he gets restored. Verses 6 and 8 through 8. When Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face, prostrated himself, and his king said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, here's your servant. And David said, do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. David did more than just rescue him from Lodabar. Mephibosheth was given back the lands that Saul owned, and he was permitted to be a guest at the king's table. And all of this was done because David wanted to honor his father. Mephibosheth is just awed. He's shocked. He was not expecting any good to come, and he was curious as to why David would show such favor not only to a former enemy's son, but one who could not give him back anything due to his disability. Waiting for the catch or the stipulation, he referred to himself as a dead dog, and in verse 8 he says, what is your servant, that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? It's very difficult for people who are hurting, people who are living in shame, to accept or expect goodness from the hands of others, especially if it's goodness that they cannot repay because they think, oh, it's just one more thing that's on me, one more thing to push me down. But David didn't care. He completely restored Mephibosheth. David had brought Mephibosheth to the castle. Now he says that he's to be treated like an adopted son. He will eat and sit at the table of the kings with all the other sons, just like he's an adopted son. He's going to be a member of royalty, and he would never again want. Saul's servant Ziba, his 15 sons and 20 servants, well, they're going to move in and take care of all the land, and he's just going to be part of the royalty. Mephibosheth was married with a son by the name of Micah, and this covenant even extended to his son. He would no longer be a father who could not care for his family. Oh, the grace that was given to him. David's promise to Jonathan extended throughout his entire life. From the day of the fall to being placed at the king's table and treated like Mephibosheth, treated like a son, Mephibosheth is a picture of how God reaches down through his grace to show his kindness, to show his grace and his love to us so that we can be a member of God's family. Mephibosheth no longer had to live with the stigma of shame. Mephibosheth means son of shame. And when David found him, he became a member of the family. And then he could take back his original name, Meribbaal, the dispeller of shame. His shame was removed. And just like Mephibosheth, we have been rescued. You and I have been rescued. Jesus took our shame. He took our sin. And everything like Mephibosheth, who expected punishment, we expected punishment for our sins. But he made us sons of the Most High God, son of the King of Kings. And in his presence, we're covered with the blood of Jesus. David only wanted Mephibosheth to accept his kindness and sit at his table. He was not trying to make him feel better. Oh, no, he wasn't just giving him mercy and compassion and comfort. He was doing more than that. He was giving him a brand new identity. And grace does the very same thing. It takes us out of our shame and moves us on a path so that we're no longer in that, but it's leading us away from shame. What is shame? It's a self-centered perception. Yeah, it's when we think about ourselves. And perceptions and feelings don't always point to the truth, but a revelation of God's grace to you and of his identity, of who you are. It can conquer your negative feelings and establish healthy expectations so that you can know that, like Mephibosheth, you do have a future and a hope. What happened to you, it might be true. You can look and say, yes, this happened and this happened and this happened. But that's not the whole story. That's the story only up to this point. Because God has something greater in store for you. He has a future. You haven't seen the end of the story yet. God is always working, and he's refining you into his image. He wants you not to see yourself and not to be defined by your lameness, but to see yourself as a strong child of God walking in his grace. And our limitations do not limit God. He does exceedingly abundantly more than we can ever ask or think. And even as we go through this life, and even after we have said, yes, I believe in what Jesus did for me, and I believe he's the Son of God, and I want to be a child of God, we're still going to make mistakes. But God is not surprised. He is not surprised by our failures. No, we may never be able to right the wrongs that have been done to us, the hurts that we have, but we don't have to hide. Being a prisoner of the past only negatively impacts our present and our future. When grace is allowed to define us, it changes everything. When we find our identity in Jesus, we're made whole, we're made complete, we're no longer living in the shame. Our shame no longer defines us because Jesus, he is the author, the finisher of our faith and who we are. All Israel noticed David's kindness to Mephibosheth, and they marveled, how could this ever happen? Well, people look at us when we accept Jesus, and they see us, his treasured sons and daughters, and they marvel at the difference we have, the difference he makes in us, because we are no longer defined by our lameness, not by our success, and certainly not by our shame, but we're defined by his grace and by his love. That's what he wants to extend to you today.